All right, Elizabeth, that's everybody so far. I'll keep admitting as we go along, but I'll pass it off to you to start.
I think I'll jump in here right away then, Stephanie. So, okay, so we'll get going. It's always a little, a ragged process getting these things going as everyone joins. Welcome everybody to the first webinar run by the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm pretty confident you're going to find this a rewarding experience. I'm Lauren Dawson. Many of you undoubtedly know me, but I'm the co-founder of TSAS and the current co-director of TSAS. I'm just going to be with you for a few moments just to welcome you, explain why this is happening, and then we'll proceed with our activity for today. So TSAS grants, provides grants for research to Canadian scholars and scholars outside of Canada as well. And twice a year, we usually have in-person workshops with academics and policy people from government and others to discuss some of the findings from those research projects. Needless to say, like everyone else, we've had both of our workshops this year, one planned for April and one planned for today, scuttled. So here we are working in the webinar format like everyone else. Today, you're going to hear some of the findings from projects that we're going to be presenting back in April. You have one set in this morning, and then as many of you know, at 1 o'clock this afternoon, there's another two projects presenting their findings. I'd just like to have you know that we really appreciate Carleton University. Carleton University was going to be hosting our October 7th workshop. In lieu of it being canceled, they have very graciously provided the opportunity for us to run this webinar. So I'd like to send a really strong thanks to Carleton University Department or Faculty of Public Affairs for sponsoring this event. Much appreciated. Now, I also would like to just call your attention to the fact that we'll have another webinar on October 22nd. So mark that date in your calendars. Announcements will be going out about it from TSAS very shortly. I think some preliminary announcements already were issued. At that workshop, there'll be presentation of material that would have been presented at the October 7th in-person workshop. That's a joint webinar held with the Defense and Security Foresight Group. So it'll be a large number of people involved from both networks. That's it. That's all I really wanted to say, just as I say, to give you a bit of context and welcome. I'm very pleased now to turn over events to our moderator, Dr. Vanessa Iafola from the Department of Criminology at St. Mary's University. She very graciously agreed to do this, and I'm confident we're in very good hands. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. It's my great pleasure today to introduce our panel who will be speaking to us on issues of gender violence and terrorism. The first presenter I'd like to introduce to you today is Ms. Johanna Massé. Ms. Massé is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Political Science at Université Laval. Ms. Massé's scholarly interests center on issues of gender violence, homegrown terrorism, and radicalization. And in particular, she is interested in the process of radicalization of women in Europe and the Americas. Her dissertation examines women's engagement in violence during political conflict in nationalist contexts, comparing the Troubles in Northern Ireland with conflict in Palestine from 1967 until the end of the First Intifada. Ms. Massé is currently a lecturer in political science at Bishop's University, and she will defend her doctoral work in the near future. So this promises to be an excellent presentation, and I hope you give her your full attention and have many questions for her at the end. Thank you.
So I just share my PowerPoint. Does it work?
Yep.
Yes, thank you. So this presentation is based on the working paper I've made for TSAS and yeah, I made as part of I was grateful to receive a student fellowship for doing my fieldwork as part of my doctoral thesis. And yes, so I'm really interested in political violence and gender. And over the year, it changed a lot. And yes, right now, my thesis title is in French, Femmes de en guerre, voix de l'engagement féminin face à la violence. So it's kind of a funny take on voice and journey to political violence. And what I'm really interested in too is women's activism during political conflict. But in my case, it's nationalist one, which is very important to take into account because it the context kind of changed how the engagement goes on and how violence is taking place. So in my case, I was especially interested in two cases. So the Northern Ireland Troubles during so between 1968 and 1988, and Palestine between the beginning of occupation in 1967 and the end of the first Intifada. It's very important to really consider the context, this specific context about how it changed the way we see women's radicalization, because yes, it's not as the same that we could see in the Canadian context and nowadays. So yes, but when I began to get interested into this subject, it was because I was really frustrated about how violence study, conflict study and terrorism study in specific, but how violence, when it came to women, were described, were deepened, because just look at most literature, most book on political violence, get at the very end of the book and just search an entry for women. Most of the time, there's nothing about women, about the perspective of women, their point of view, how they evolved in a contextual, in this context, in this violent context, and when women were talked about, women were talked about, most of the time we didn't hear from women themselves, and there was a lot of essentialist representation about women, about what, based on conception of femininity and masculinity. And yes, in the literature, there was also how participation, how violence was conceptualized, was problematic, because once again, in specific contexts, as the ones that interested me, which were, yes, it's terrorist violence, yes, it's a civil conflict type of warfare, but the question of how to conceptualize participation in illegitimate institution, organization, wasn't able to really capture how women involved in such context. So yes, and so yes, there was a lot of problem in such literature, even if there was quite a few jewels, and I was very happy to find them. But it was most of the time representation of women has beautiful souls. whereas the men were the soldier. So there was this intrinsically pacific view of women, which made war in such a context, I mean, violence in such a context, in an unilateral direction. Violence was made to women. Women were intrinsically pacific. So it wasn't, I mean, how they react to violence and how they could engage in violent actions weren't very looked at, because because of such representation, it wasn't natural to see women acting in a violent way. So yes, there was this idea that because women are life-giving beings, so because of their reproductive abilities, they couldn't be life-taking, or even if they weren't mother at this point, I mean, because they had reproductive capability, it was impossible to see how they could engage in such actions, which were seen as, I mean, nasty stuff. So yes, and it was also the idea of women being as children, so being political innocent, which was a way to depoliticize their action, because they were seen as non-political beings, which was kind of very problematic, because once again, it took away their agency as human beings. So yes, and last thing about such literature was that most of the time, a woman who follow the femininity models were kind of seen as an homogeneous group. There were the good woman and the bad one, which we didn't take into account because they were unnatural. But to be a woman, so a good woman, you have to correspond to one model. And then that's one of the difference that I found between men and women in such a context. So yeah, I mean, I look at the terrorist study literature, and I had some problem with how it was done, and I saw it as mostly a masculine framework. And I wanted to go in Northern Ireland, in Palestine, in my case, but to see how it was done on the field, and what was the opinion of women who engage in such context about their relation with violence. So because I identify, I mean, I'm not the only one, but I identify 3 problems with such literature, which was the very few first-hand analysis that we had, which is still a problem nowadays, because I mean, it's comparing to other type of violence, terrorism isn't as diffuse as other type of violence. So hopefully, but yes, but we don't have enough first-hand analysis about such violence. And we don't have micro-level analysis, which I mean, other type are very interesting into, but we need to get at the bottom, at the individual level, to really understand most specifically when we look at the reason why people engage in such violence. And lastly, in my case, that we need to pay attention to what can be seen as marginal voice, because even if nowadays in the current literature, women are seen as very few and very marginal when it comes to terrorist violence and political violence. I mean, the data is lacking, and we are not really sure, I mean, the extent, the breadth of women involvement, because of the way history is recorded, because the few testimony that we got, but because there's this thing that men are much more open to discuss their experiences as agent in such a context than women. And for this reason, I mean, women can be much more difficult to get access to, especially in both my context. I mean, as a woman, I was able to get into touch with some activists and all kinds of stuff, but access is very problematic when it came to such a problem. But yes. Oh, sorry. So yes, and behind, I mean, this problem in the literature, there was the problem of how to see the agency of women in such a context. I mean, it's kind of a philosophical problem and a feminist one, but it's very difficult to capture how to analyze agency in such contexts which are oppressive contexts, but where we have to accept that it's not because women are engaging in action which are seen as bad or even against their own interest. And we can see that in between the difference between nationalism and feminism, and how in some cases nationalism I mean, is a patriarchal ideology. So by being involved in nationalist activity, is it against the woman's interest? But it's difficult to capture that in the literature. And I mean, there's a few important contributions in this field, and you have the concept of victimcy, for example, by TSAS, but which is much more about how the status of victim can be used to get access to some prerogative and rights. But in the case that I was interested in too, which was very interesting, is that most women I met kind of position, I mean, didn't want to see themselves as victims. It was impossible for them to present themselves as victims. It was what was called, I mean, in the literature by Aretsaga, a choiceless decision, but it was a decision at the end. I mean, so it's kind of a way to get back their agency, but in a context which is seen as oppressive. And I think it's a dimension which is important to get more into it in the literature. But yes, it was quite visible in the field work that I was able to do. And it also led me to question, as I said at the beginning, concepts of participation, and especially, I mean, institutional participation, because we tend to see participation in terms of membership, which is very, I mean, it's the easy way to do it. And in legitimate politics, yes. But when it comes to illegitimate violence, it's much more difficult, because violent organizations are most of the time a patriarchal organization and structure. So they won't always admit that they can do what they do because of the people's support, but especially because of women's support. And that's the difference, that's an important difference, because that's the way how we do not recognize people who are much more involved in logistic world and in behind the scene world, which it's the next slide. But so when we look at institutional participation, it's important to get that in mind, it's linked to the different, the difficult difference to make between the battlefront and the home front, especially in a conflict, in nationalistic conflict, as both that I studied, because it was a war. So the difference between the battlefront and the home front were very much blurry, and thus helping the terrorist organization wasn't always seen as helping this organization, but much more as helping the community as a whole. So yes, and it's funny because I met two sisters during my fieldwork, and we made an interview, and during this interview we was like, we didn't get involved, we never went involved because we didn't have time, because I've got pregnant early on, but I wanted to, but I couldn't because of life. But at some point, she explained to me that it was not every day, but it was natural to come back to the home and then to prepare petrol bomb and then go back to your life. But for them, it wasn't seen as being part of the conflict, as being engaged in violence. It was something seen as just being part of a community, which was in conflict, in a conflict situation. So even for the individuals, the women themselves, the question of participation is not always apprehended as a whole, if we can say so. And yes, it's when we look at women, and it was clear also in the fieldwork, so social restraint, constraint about, having children, having most of the time your husband sent to jail, so you have to protect the familial unity. It's a lot to do in a conflict situation, and if we think of the mental charge of women at this time, you understand how they didn't really. Most of them didn't have the time to get involved in a more direct way, but it wasn't because they didn't want to get involved. Sometimes it was just because they couldn't, because they had other responsibility, and I think it's very important to get that, because it has a lot of ramification about post-conflict situation, because it's not because you are not directly engaged that you don't believe in what is defended in the ideology. So yes, one of the activists that I met was very much engaged in an institutional way, and she was sent to prison for a lot of time. But as she explained, when she was asked what she wanted, it's like she wanted a wife, because she has so much to do that a wife will be very helpful to her. So yes, and I think it's really important to get the implication, the role, and the different form of engagement of women, because when during the conflict, but when violence stops, you cannot have reconciliation if we just put half of the population away without asking them how they feel, and most of the time they won't tell you by themselves, because at this time for women, they didn't think they had the space and the opportunity to be heard, to get their testimony, because they didn't see themselves as part of the conflict once again. So yes, it was I was able to do, and it's the basis of what my thesis is about. So if you have questions, I'll be very, or recommendation or anything, just tell me. And yes, I hope I didn't stay too long.
Hi, can we ask questions? It's David.
Hi, so I think we're going to hold our questions until the end. So if you could just jot that down for me, and please feel free to share your questions in the chat, and we'll pass them to the presenters at the very end. So I'm going to go on and introduce our next presenter. Jessica Davis is our next presenter. Ms. Davis is the President and Principal Consultant at Insight Threat Intelligence, and is an internationally recognized expert on various political and social dimensions of terrorism. Ms. Davis brings to the study of terrorism a wealth of field experience in Canadian security and intelligence. She is, as if that's not enough, currently pursuing her doctorate at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and is the author of Women in Modern Terrorism, From Liberation Wars to Global Jihad and the Islamic State. Ms. Davis, it's your turn.
Thanks so much. So I'll just get my screen sharing going. So I think that should be working now. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Looks great.
Perfect, thank you. So first of all, I want to take a second and just thank, first of all, TSAS for funding this research and Carleton for hosting the session, but also my colleagues who I've been working with on this, who are Leah West, who will be presenting today, and Amarnath Amarsingham, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. We've been working on this project for the last, I guess, year, and so we're quite excited to present these findings. So in terms of our research questions, what we really wanted to know were a few things. So first of all, what's the state of the literature on women in terrorism? This is a little bit of a preoccupation in the terrorism studies field in terms of understanding where our own literature is at. But then my other question was really, how influential or integrated is this research into the broader literature? And where do we go next? In terms of the motivation for the research, part of it was driven by my own, I'll say, casual irritation at some of the surprise that we see from time to time about the role of women in terrorism. So we see this a lot whenever there's a female suicide bombing. The media will present it as like quite a novel concept. But we also see it in practitioners, and I do a lot of work with practitioners, and I'm a former practitioner myself, and I've seen that a number of times, and even amongst some scholars. We also see it in the literature. There are a number of publications with little or no consideration of gender or the role of women. Now, hold that in your minds a little bit, because that may not be a problem. There are some areas where you may not actually need to incorporate that, but then there may be other places where it would be valuable. We also see a lot of assumptions about the roles of women involved in terrorism and violent extremism, especially in emerging areas like right-wing extremism. When I first started doing work in this area, it was back in the old Al-Qaeda days. And a number of my colleagues told me, you're not going to find anything interesting in terms of women in terrorism and Al-Qaeda because, the ideology really excludes women's roles. But, as we found out later, that was not really the case. There was a number of women who engaged in very active roles in Al-Qaeda. And I think the same assumptions are a little bit true in the right-wing space. Certainly our specialized experts know that that's not the case, but in terms of letting that information get out into the broader public and the media, I think that that's still a pretty significant limitation. And then the thing that really concerns me here quite a lot is the impact of some of these issues on counterterrorism policy and practice. So in terms of what we did, this is basically a lit review plus. I looked at, so first of all, I considered the terrorism literature quite broadly for this research. So it's really any scholarly work that has anything to do with terrorism and analyzes the phenomenon of terrorism. I do have a definition of terrorism, again, a bit broader than you would normally use, perhaps if you're doing like a an incident level analysis, but something that's going to capture a bit more rather than less of the field. And then I consider women in terrorism to be a subfield. So if you want to think about it as like one big bucket of all the terrorism literature, and then the women in terrorism literature is like a smaller bucket that sits within that. That's sort of what the areas of study that I'm thinking about. To identify that women in terrorism literature, obviously my colleagues and I have a lot of familiarity with the women in terrorism literature. So we snowballed off that literature using citation chaining. So essentially just looking through who's citing what, can I identify more publications that fit into my women in terrorism sort of little bucket. We also did Google Scholar searches, so topical, regional, group focused keyword searches. Again, trying to capture more of that literature rather than less. And from there, I took all of that sort of little bucket of women in terrorism literature and did citation counts. So using Google Scholar, I just counted who's being cited in what scholarly work, and is that scholarly work in the broader terrorism literature, so that bigger bucket, or is it in something else entirely? And just a quick comment on the Google Scholar piece. So other similar studies have used Google Web of Science or Scopus, but in this case, I didn't find very many citations at all of the women in terrorism literature using those two tools. So I used Google Scholar, which is particularly useful, as this quote suggests, for sectors of scholarly communication that were previously hidden from view, which is really the crux of the concern here. So I'm going to go through a few quick slides here in terms of some of our findings. So what does the women in terrorism literature look like? Well, it's growing. So I identified 448 scholarly publications. Before 2001, you can see that there's about 1 or 2 publications per year. This is kind of neat because there are events of women involved in terrorism before that, like the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party or the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. But you're not really seeing that reflected by a lot of literature. So there's no research bump, as I call it, for those two topics. You can also see, obviously, after 9/11, the growth in the women in terrorism literature. But there's also an interesting phenomenon, which is going to be no surprise to anybody who's done any scholarly publishing, that there's a lag in terms of events and then research publication of about 1 to 3 years. So, in 2007, you can see research on the Palestinian Intifada starting to work its way into the literature. In 2011, it's really referencing the Iraq War. In 2016, we start talking about Nigeria and Boko Haram. So those really represent some of those research bumps. So I just wanted to illustrate that growth in the literature. And then in terms of topics, there's quite a lot of sort of thematic issues that are being discussed in the women in terrorism literature. A lot of it does, though, focus on things or areas where we have a lot of availability of information, like media analyses or representations of women in terrorism, their tactics, suicide terrorism. And this is something that I've done in my own research. I've really focused on that suicide terrorism piece because, frankly, it's something that's easier to count. We can get some empirical data about that. So it is reflected in this sort of topical breakdown. We are seeing some new areas of research, though, in counterterrorism, motivation, recruitment, P and CVE, agency, and empowerment. And in terms of the groups and ideologies that are represented in literature, the Islamic State is by far the topic that's discussed the most in the context of women in terrorism. I will say, though, about this research that it's non-exclusive in terms of the categories. There's a lot of overlap because, as Johanna was talking about and demonstrated in her research, there's a lot of comparative research that goes on. So scholars tend to do multiple case studies and then compare the results with them. So like, for instance, Hamas and Al-Qaeda, or Boko Haram and other jihadist groups as well. So there's a lot of comparison that goes on. So the most studied groups are obviously Islamic State, LTTE, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Chechnya, the West writ large, so foreign fighters figures in there, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Nigeria, and the least studied, so the areas where there are gaps, are Southeast Asia, Tunisia, Algeria, and then that whole spectrum of right-wing extremism, white supremacist neo-Nazism. There are works in that area, but they're underrepresented, in my view, compared to the phenomenon itself. So just to push through to some real findings here. So really what we were trying to get at is how influential is that women in terrorism bucket in terms of the terrorism literature writ large? And you can see from this that it's maybe not so influential. So 285 scholarly publications on women terrorism received absolutely no citations in the broader literature on terrorism. And then you can work your way down the chart yourself. I'll spare you me reading it, but 122 had between 1 and 5 citations. I put up my own publications there for a little bit of self-effacing humor. So my 2013 article on female suicide bombers in Iraq has received 4 citations in the scholarly terrorism literature. And my book from 2017 received 2. So you can see that, there's really, in a lot of cases, there's just not a lot of cross-pollination between our little bucket of women in terrorism and our big bucket of terrorism. I will say, though, that a lot of this literature is much more broadly cited outside of that core terrorism literature. So, some of these people who are sitting at 0 citations in the terrorism literature are actually being broadly cited in other fields of study. And the women in terrorism literature is very good at citing within itself. So, while my book has had 2 citations in the terrorism literature, there's a lot more within people who study women in terrorism. So probably you're asking yourself, is this a problem? And it's a bit of a mixed answer. I think there are some very good reasons why this happens, but there are some problems as well, and we'll talk about those. So in part, I think some of this does demonstrate that there's a lack of integration of this literature into the broader field that suggests both conceptual and methodological problems in at least some aspects of terrorism studies. So in counterterrorism or countering violent extremism, not considering a gender component and specifically roles of women and radicalization processes of women, that is a problem. In other areas, there may be less of an issue to not considering women or gender components as well. And really the big question for me is, what are the policy implications of this? So practitioners do read this literature. So how does this impact their worldview? If women's roles in terrorism isn't being represented in some of the most popular and most well-read publications on terrorism, is this something that practitioners are then ignoring? So I just want to finish on a bit of a research agenda. So we did identify a number of areas where we think there could be some great work done. So it'll seem a little bit odd to say this at the front end. I think that there's a lot of value to be done in male-only case studies, because while we've done a lot of male-centric work, we haven't actually done it from a gender perspective. So we haven't examined why groups that do exclude women, and specifically ones that exclude them entirely, do that. So there's some space for work there. There's also a need for enhanced focus on non-kinetic roles. So again, that emphasis on suicide bombers has been useful at the front end. Now we really need to expand our research and think about roles of women in facilitation and financing. I think there's also a lot of space for research on non-binary gender and terrorism, both from the perspective of how terrorist organizations may accept or not accept people who have a non-binary gender, or how radicalization and extremism narratives impact people of a non-binary gender. I think there's a lot of space for great research there. And in relatedly masculinities and femininities as well, that is a developing field, but again, lots more work there. I'd also love to see other measures of impact other than the ones that I used here, in terms of expanding out this particular research. So I was speaking to Professor Wilner about this research at the beginning, and he suggested things like looking at course syllabi or panels at conferences as other measures of influence. And finally, my last point is really about looking at how gender and identity factors influence citations. So there's been some research that suggests that women and visible minorities are cited less often than their male counterparts. And my hunch is that this may be an issue in this literature as well. So that would be another area of research. And if anybody wants to take up that research, I'd happily share this data with them. So that's it for me. I just want to say thank you again to TSAS for funding this research and for hosting this event along with Carleton. And I'll pass it on to Leah, who's going to talk about the real impact of some of these issues.
Hi, everyone. Again, thank you to TSAS. Oh, sorry, Vanessa. You want to introduce me, or I can just roll right in. I know we're short on time.
Up to you. Go ahead.
Okay.
I can
Let me just
after.
People can look me up later. I just don't want to, you know, we've got limited amounts of time here, and I'll just roll in from what Jessica was saying. Hopefully you'll see my slides up. So I was Jessica started kind of looking at the back end, the information that influences policymakers. And I am looking at the opposite end. So when we've gone through the process of investigating, prosecuting, charging people for terrorist activity or violent extremism tied to terrorist movements. What does that look like? And how does gender impact the sentences and conviction rates that we're seeing, especially in Canada? So, just really quickly, I want to run down some broad statistics. And when we look at violent offenders in Canada writ large, so I'm not talking about just terrorism, I'm talking about crime and violent offenders. Female make up about 25% of accused on any given year for criminal offenses, right? In 2017, they were 25%. And that includes all levels of crime and violent crime. So we're starting from women make up about a quarter of violent crime in Canada. What happens when they go to trial or they are charged, right? Well, we see that 40% of women ultimately are proven to be guilty, where 52% of men are found guilty when they go to trial. So that ends up being the biggest bucket. For men, they're found guilty. The biggest bucket of what happens to women who are accused of violent crime is that those charges are stayed or withdrawn. So very, very different ends of the spectrum, right? So most violent offenders, when they're male, are convicted. Most female violent offenders have their charges stayed. Convicted female offenders are half as likely to receive a custodial sentence, right? So we already have 25% of women, right, violent offenders, those 25% less likely to actually go to trial and be found guilty. And when they do go to trial and are found guilty, they are half as likely to get custodial sentences. So about 22% versus 39% of men. Anybody that's a criminologist is not going to be shocked by any of these statistics because they're well known, they're well documented. This is not something new. But then I wanted to look at that versus what happens in the terrorism space. In the terrorism space, our colleague, Dr. Amar Marsingham, has compiled the numbers of males and females who traveled from Canada to participate in either Iraq or Syria in terrorist organizations or extremist movements. And so this isn't necessarily just ISIS. But again, when we look at the numbers, females accounted for about 28% of all Canadians who traveled to ISIS in Syria since 2012. So that number is pretty similar to what we see in terms of violent offenders, right? About 1 in 4 people who participate in this kind of activity are women. But what happens at the charge when it comes down to charging, right? In terms of Canadian history, since 2001, we've had 54 men charged with terrorism offenses. We've had 5 women charged, right? So that is a significantly smaller percentage, right? We're looking at 8.3% of people charged with terrorism offenses are women. By the approximate, we would expect 25% who would participate in those offenses, right? In terms of convictions, the percentage is even less. We've had 27 men convicted and only 1 woman convicted, one of the 5. So of those convicted, women make up 3.5%. And then when we look at the average sentence, which is hard because we're dealing with an N of 1 when we're talking about women, the average sentence for a man is 12 years, 8 months. The one female that's been convicted, and I will say she actually committed a terrorist act. She committed violence in the name of ISIS and caused minor injuries to someone. She received 7 years. But all persons who were charged with terrorism offenses in Canada and convicted have received custodial sentences. So here is just a brief rundown of what this looks like in other countries, right? Are we that much different? And realistically, when we look at percentages, we're not all that far off from the UK, US, or Australia, right? Obviously, the numbers of people convicted or, sorry, charged with terrorism offenses is much smaller in Canada than we see in the UK, the United States, or Australia. But the percentages are about the same. 10.7% in the United States are women, 7.8 in the US, 9.5 in Australia, and 8.3 in Canada, right? But the numbers of convicted are much smaller in Canada. And Australia, for example, has only had terrorism offenses on the books that have captured the activities that they're charging women since 2014. And they've been much more successful in terms of getting convictions of women in Australia. So these are the 5 women who have been charged with terrorism offenses in Canada since 2001. There's not a lot similar between the stories of these women, but for the fact that in 3 of the 5 cases, they were arrested alongside partners, right? So that leads me to question whether or not these women, had they not been partnered with someone who was potentially under investigation, would they have been arrested and charged? It's hard to tell, but so we've got 3 women who were arrested with partners. 1 woman, Rehab Jigmosh, who I said committed an actual act of violence. She actually traveled abroad, got to Turkey, was turned around by the Turkish officials because someone in her own family called the RCMP and said, my sister is traveling abroad to join traveling abroad to Syria to join ISIS. Canadian officials told Turkish officials returned her. She was then questioned by RCMP members, told them, no, I was just going to visit family, and they let her go. This does not happen with men. What also happened afterwards is that she then, apparently not subject to surveillance, committed actual acts of violence by attacking people in a Canadian Tire. And it was only at that point that she was actually arrested and charged with traveling to join ISIS. So these aren't great numbers in terms of Canada if we're thinking that 25% of women, 25% of people who engage in terrorist activity are probably women. When we think that the only conviction we have for a woman involved with terrorism is someone who was let go and then committed an act of violence, and then we bothered to prosecute her. So the hypothesis, why? Trying to explain the why of this. Well, there's been studies in the United States, for example, that look at the gendered framing of women in terrorism. US data compiled most recently by Natalie Galeka supports that idea. She looked at 2 of the most frequently charged terrorism offenses, looked at the number of people charged, the average sentences between them. You'll see here the average sentence for female versus male was quite different. And she explained this using explain this because there was gendered narratives surrounding the women involved in those cases. Those most common gender narratives were infantilization, reliance on male ISIS members, and parental responsibilities. So she saw that in the cases where women were charged and convicted, the language around them was very gendered. We also have seen research out of CTED that reports that upon return, women who were abroad, when they return to Western Europe or North America, they have been treated with more leniency. There's been less charges, and when they are charged, there's more lenient sentences compared to men. And the expectation there is that it's because of these gendered stereotypes, right? Not as on a basis of a true assessment of aggravating and mitigating factors that have an impact on sentencing. So my hypothesis was the same thing would be happening here in Canada. But unfortunately, we don't have enough numbers to make a good, to have some good analysis on that. But what I did see was the opposite. I saw mailed gender framing in the studies, in the cases where men were charged and convicted. And those male gendered framed the men as either evil or evildoers, right? So they weren't just criminals, they were evil, or they were cowards and traitors. So this was how the two kind of framings that we saw for the men convicted of terrorism in Canada, which we did not see at all in the one case where a female was sentenced. That language, the discussion of those who engage in terrorism as evil or cowards just didn't come up in her case, but we see it over and over and over again when sentencing men. So I've left up two examples here, but in Lemond, where 3 men from Ottawa were actually charged and sentenced, or convicted and sentenced, this was language from their case. Involvement in jihadist terrorist activity effectively amounted to a crime of treason, rejected of all that is brave and right and honorable, and embracing all that is hateful and cowardly and evil. Those who embrace ISIL are embracing the devil. In so doing, that betrays themselves, their friends, their families, their fellow citizens, their religion, and their country. They embody all the most odious forms of human frailty and understandably proper reaction of profound and rightly deserved contempt from all who value goodness and humanity in the world. Right? So this isn't typical language we see in sentencing, but it is frequently used when sentencing men for terrorist activity. So I think the takeaway here is that as we move forward and engage in comparative analysis of sentencing and convictions of men and women, we shouldn't necessarily start with the convictions and sentences of men being the correct baseline, right? That's not the baseline upon which we should necessarily compare female sentencing, because it seems that the gendered framing of men is aggravating their sentences away from what might be a neutral or an appropriate sentence based on typical principles of sentencing. So I think that's my real takeaway as we continue to examine the treatment of women, which may be, should we ever return females from Syria, something that we're going to start to engage in, that the appropriate place to start is not the sentencing of men. The other interesting factor I found was that mental health, which can be a mitigating factor at sentencing and often is in criminal law, actually had significantly reduced the sentence of the one female charged with terrorism in Canada, but has had almost no impact on sentencing at men. And that again might be the result of how we've framed the choices of the men as being either evil or cowardly. So I'll stop there, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much. Just for everyone's benefit and edification, I'd just like to, I guess, introduce Leah West. She is currently a lecturer of international affairs at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Her areas of expertise lie in the fields of national security law, counterterrorism, and cyber operations. Ms. West is currently an SJD candidate at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, where her research explores the application of criminal, constitutional, and international law to state conduct in cyberspace. She is also a founding editor of the Intrepid blog, which you can find at intrepidpodcast.com. And Ms. West as well will also shortly defend her doctoral research. So I'd just like to thank the entire panel for all of their excellent presentations. And one of the themes that I noticed unifying the research that you've all conducted is an emphasis on understanding women's agency in these highly contextual and conflict-driven spaces. I'm enjoying, as we talk about women's agency, the little statuette of Ruth Bader Ginsburg behind Ms. West. And so in the spirit of discussing women's role in terrorism, I'm just wondering if each of the panel wouldn't mind speaking to the question of women's agency and how women perhaps might navigate their own roles, something, for example, that Ms. Massé spoke to in the context of engaging in terrorism. So I'll leave that with the panel.
Okay, maybe I'll just start with a quick comment. both on how the literature deals with this, but then also from my other research as well. So the literature is increasingly concerned with this question of agency, and we're starting to see more and more publications that are incorporating it as a concept or focusing on it directly, which I think is a really important piece here. From my own and other research, I've found that the issue of agency is one that, especially in media reporting, is so easily polarized. So it's either women are represented exclusively as victims or exclusively as perpetrators. And in a lot of cases, you'll have media and some practitioners who will argue that women are more radicalized than men, or they have to be more radicalized or are more violent than men to be obtaining this kind of thing, the same level of notoriety. And I think those are all very superficial analyses of agency. And for the most part, for the women that I've studied, particularly in the foreign fighter context, agency is much more of a spectrum that, depending on where we are in terms of where they are in the conflict, their level of agency and involvement and their roles in the terrorist organization shifts pretty significantly.
Thank you for that. Johanna or Leah, would you like, or Leah, excuse me, would you like to join in? Johanna, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yes, so I completely agree with Jessica, and I talk a little about it. But yes, but just to get back to what Jessica say about women that had to, were represented as more violent, more bloody, more in that. But that's also because, once again, violent organizations are mostly patriarchal. So for women who are involved in a direct way, in an institutional recognized membership way, the context that they had to be more than the men, that to appear more involved, to be more engaged and in an ideological way. But that's true that we have to, when we assess agency, we have to see that as a spectrum, and doing a dichotomy between victim and perpetrator is just wrong for women and men, because it's problematic for men also to see them just as the bad men. And so yes, it's about the question of contextualize the involvement. It's very important. In my case, as I said, it was always, most of the time seen as a choiceless decision, but in other contexts, just listen to the people involved themselves, see how they present themselves, and don't let the media talk about it.
Johanna, just to follow up on that question, I have a question from the audience, which asks, did you find that women had re-envisioned their participation in the terrorist events or activities in which they participated over the years? So, as time wore on, and did they reinterpret their experiences?
That's very interesting. And in fact, it's one venue that I want to pursue for my postdoctorate, but several, in the concept that I'm interested in too, which is nationalist concept, women are used as icons to get engaged to, because in nationalist concept, often you have to protect the mother country, which is a mother. So, the figure of the woman is used for women themselves, but also for the men as a way to induce an engagement. But it's, once again, it's a representation of women which do not contain any agency of women themselves. They're just a figure. They're just a model. So women who were engaged at some point don't find, when they look at commemoration, in the case of Northern Ireland, in murals, in song, in poster, often, how they are represented do not correspond to the reality of their engagement, their past engagement. but for part of them also, as I said, they didn't recognize themselves as engaged, as having participated in the violence itself. So there's some kind of, when you are hearing the story, there's some kind of, yes, I was part of it, but I wasn't involved. So I don't have a say I don't have a say in how it was for women, because I'm not a participant. I wasn't in the conflict, which is false. I mean, but they don't see themselves as full actor, which is also interesting about the agency dimension of that. But yes.
Sorry, just to follow up. So would you say that for those women who, I mean, I guess participated tangentially or didn't participate, that their own understanding of their participation in experiences or events of terrorism had to be directly or more closely tied to, for lack of a good example and for something very sort of stereotypical, but to actually planting and setting off a bomb, or to actually, right? Is it that kind of direct immediacy with respect to violence that they would feel they needed to have to claim that kind of terrorist agency?
Yes, but there's also the fact that for women, once again, in my case study, you still have a stigma attached to the violent engagement, and some women, I mean, haven't told their children about how mommy did a sting in prison for having done some very bad thing. So sometimes there's no confrontation of the past. So it's very a multi-layered phenomena. And when it comes to the reflexive positionality of women, of what they done, of how it was framed in the collective memory, which is done by men most of the time. So yes, it's but it's a dimension that I'm really interested in too, and I want to go further on for Northern Ireland. So if you have funding.
Excellent, that's great. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And Leah, do you have anything you'd like to contribute to this discussion, perhaps with respect to the law's view of women's agency in terrorism?
So the law is neutral on this issue in terms of agency, right? In terms gender neutral, right? Laws require a certain level of action and a certain level of intent, and terrorism is different from almost all other criminal offenses because it also requires a motive. But in these cases, they're truly gender neutral. Sometimes what we've seen is discussions, especially in the media, about the fact that the activities that women engaged with, especially when we're talking about the women who traveled abroad to participate or support ISIS, wouldn't be captured by the law. But those laws are quite broad. Participation and facilitation does not come with a list of activities that is captured and that is criminal versus not. So it really depends on how the law is applied. And I think there's one question here about the number of men and women who are investigating these offenses. And if you conceive certain activities as participating in advancing a terrorist organization versus others that don't, and you take a gendered lens to what that is, right? Only picking up a weapon is participating or advancing the goals of a terrorist organization versus potentially feeding, taking care of them, cleaning weapons, all these other types of activities that women may have been involved with, bearing children, even, some would argue. It depends on how you frame participation in terms of those activities. So I think that's where we could see gender really having an impact on how the law applies. It's just how broadly we want to consider activities that actually do advance the interests of a terrorist organization, and whether or not the actions that women, at least, we know that women participate across the spectrum, but where we see a lot of women participating, whether or not they'd be captured by their actions. And so far, I haven't seen, and Jessica would know better than me because she does track this very closely, I haven't seen many women participating or charged with war crimes or terrorism offenses unless their activities really were about maintaining slaves or beating women who are, you know, enslaved in their household, that kind of thing. We haven't seen, you know, mere participation in the fact that they lived and advanced the work of the caliphate. We haven't seen offenses for that, I think, across really anywhere, but Jessica would know better.
Yeah, we've actually seen a couple of charges for participation or living within the caliphate. And actually, interestingly, I think the most recent conviction in Germany was of a woman who kept a Yazidi slave, but she wasn't charged with that. Like, she was charged with the terrorism offenses specifically. So it was a bit of an interesting case. But I think we're going to actually see a lot more of that going forward.
Wonderful, excellent. Just to kind of keep in the vein of women and women's participation and experiences, there's a question with respect to methodology, Johanna, which I see from the audience and which I actually personally am interested in. So I'm gonna just push this to the top of the line. The question reads, my question would be to highlight an interest in hearing more about where Johanna Massé's case study data was from, the characteristics of the sample she used. So I would love to hear about that. I know Dr. Jans would like to hear about that.
So yeah, methodologically speaking, I use an abductive method, which I don't start with hypothesis, and I really wanted to go in the field to see what I could get. So, and I didn't have any peculiar access before going then, so it was quite hard. But the idea was meet women activists and also women who were in the context, for just have a look at how they saw the woman activist. But when I went there, I mean, the difference between both were kind of very blurry. And so I was able to get a sample of, it's a small sample because I just stayed about in total, 3 months in Northern Ireland and 6 weeks in Palestine. And so I met around 14 women in Northern Ireland, and almost as well in Palestine. But in Palestine, it was not as dependent as in Northern Ireland because I don't speak Arab, which was kind of very problematic. And yes, I could get access to this sample by Snowball, and just I went to the Sinn Féin. I contact their women politics, and then I get back to also prisoner groups and women's groups and everyone who could talk to me, because comparing to Palestine, for example, the Northern Ireland was very much studied, which means people are very much worried. Worried to get once again a scientist which will ask them some question. But in Palestine, it was much more easier because, I mean, the context is that they want their story to be heard. So they are much more open about meeting, and yes, that's my sample in the whole.
Thank you for answering that question. I personally find it impressive when anyone's able to uncover people who are willing to speak in sort of like hidden or secretive populations, and to be able to convince people to share their own experiences of involvement in the Troubles it's wonderful and interesting data. So thank you so much for that.
I'm very grateful. I mean, it's like the people that I met, which most of them have done some bad thing, but I was very grateful to have to get them to get me times to get some of personal experience, and it was for them, it was very difficult. some of them, I mean, the politics were kind of used to the game, so it was the rhetoric was quite prepared and fine, and yes, but the everyday woman was kind of difficult. I mean, for me and for her, and so I'm very grateful to have their help and their story.
Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you. Jessica, there's a question with respect to the prevalence of citations, or the amount, or perhaps lack thereof, of citations in the larger field with respect to women in terrorism. I mean, I'm sure that this pertains to your specific research, not only, but also to other research in the field. Would you be willing to speak to that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the good, and then I'll get into the bad. So I think charitably, there's a number of topics in the terrorism field that don't necessarily lend themselves well to like a gendered inclusion. So, you know, off the top of my head, I could think of like a biography of a particular leader. You know, maybe it seems pretty acceptable, I'd say, that incorporating much of a gender perspective, particularly if it's, well, even a women in terrorism perspective, let me be very clear here. If it's a man who has no real relationship with women, it makes sense that there's not really any inclusion of that women in terrorism literature. But at the same time, I would actually challenge people to think about topics that shouldn't have at least a gender component, and if not a women in terrorism component. And these things really do need to be considered separately, because gender includes, you know, obviously men and masculinities and that kind of stuff. The other thing that I found that was more troubling was there were a number of publications that talked about women in terrorism and then didn't cite any of the literature. So it was just presented as common knowledge, kind of obliterating the research that had gone on before that. So that was definitely part of the bad. The other piece that I kind of wonder about a little bit was if the whole idea of talking about women in terrorism sort of lives in what Rachel Schmidt's research is called the gender ghetto, that people don't necessarily want to talk about it lest they be forced to always talk about it. So I think that was a bit of a problem. And then just to end on the good, there were a number of, a few really excellent examples of research that incorporated an analysis of women in a terrorist organization or a particular set of activities where women weren't a significant component, but they still managed to reflect on the literature, look at their data, write a paragraph or two about the absence or inclusion of that literature, and cite the researchers who had done that work. So it was a real mixed bag.
Okay, excellent. And so I guess to kind of follow up on that as a positive push toward the end of this discussion, if I could ask each of you, where would you like to see the field take the issue of women in terrorism next? Or where would you like to see the field grow with respect to its analysis of gender? I recognize, Jessica, that you spoke to this a bit, but I'd still love to hear more about it.
I'd like to start by stop making assumptions that the comparison between male and female, you know, that male is necessarily the right way to approach counterterrorism or even research towards terrorism. I think we start with that assumption and then treat female always in comparison to that. And I don't necessarily think that that's true. And I think this is what I'm starting to see in my research, is that we take gendered frames and gendered lens to approaching terrorism by males as well. And I think that we need to stop framing our comparisons in that way, as assuming that whatever's happening in terms of men is the right way to approach things.
And I mean, what is interesting in thinking about the gender dimension of terrorism is that we need to study women in order to understand the whole phenomenon, and it had implication for men themselves, because how we stereotyping women are kind of also stereotyping men themselves. So we are working on a basis which is a false basis, because it's just based on half of the world population. So we cannot understand the whole phenomenon if we don't hear the woman's voice as part of the man's voice, and we have to get them on an equal basis just to understand the phenomenon as a whole, and maybe get a better understanding of men action as well.
Yeah, and then just to elaborate a little bit on some of the work that I'm curious to see done, you know, we definitely have some great research happening on women in terrorism that needs to continue. Obviously, all the things that I laid out are areas I want to see research, but what I really also want to see is the inclusion of gender in new analyses of a variety of different phenomena as potentially a confounding variable or an explanatory variable. So incorporating it better into that existing literature. And I know that there's a number of people in the audience today who are reviewers for journals. So I would challenge them, when you're reviewing articles about terrorism, to ask whether or not gender has been considered as one of those types of variables, even if the main topic isn't gender, and how looking at that might enhance that research.
Thank you. I really appreciate your answers. And as a scholar in the field more broadly of terrorism, I really do appreciate being able to learn from the three of you about a bit more about the centrality and the importance of gender in analyses of terrorism, whether it be sort of the kind of case study or the comparative method that Johanna has used, or with respect to your research, Leah and Jessica, on sentencing and citation. I'm always elated to see these kinds of analyses pushing the field forward and to new areas. Just before we adjourn, I would like to open up to Ms. Ford, who is going to be sharing some information about upcoming workshops for the Terrorism, Security, and Society Research Network. I assume that everybody who is a member, or who's participating today, rather, who's come to see us today, has already joined TSAS as a member, but if you haven't, feel free to stick around, and we will provide in the chat information about how you can join as a senior affiliate, as a junior affiliate, or as a non-academic affiliate. TSAS does some really great work. There are grants that are put out that have been put out, calls for grants that have been put out at different periods of the year. There's always new and exciting research that's being shared via research reports. TSAS is active in terms of its social media presence as well. And of course, as always, there are excellent events such as this one that we would love to have you attend. So if you'd like more information, if you'd like to participate, if you'd like to become more involved, we'd be delighted to have you. The information for the second workshop will be coming right up, if I can just figure out how to share the screen. So please apologize. I appear young, but in my soul, I am very old and technologically incapable. Apologies. And of course, if there are other questions, I would be delighted to entertain them before we finish. All right, so just one moment. Bottom middle button will, oh, okay, I'm so sorry, this is terrible. All right, so I will just figure out how to share this, and okay, here we go. So sorry. No, there it is. I hope you can all see that on screen. It is the, oops, there it is. It's an advertisement for an event on violent extremism in Canada. It's happening October 23rd, 2020. It'll be moderated by the excellent, very excellent Veronica Kitchen from the University of Waterloo. And the panel featured will be also the very excellent scholars, Michael Nesbitt at the University of Calgary, Shandon Harris Hogan from Victoria University, Jillian Hunchak, and Steve Hewitt from Birmingham. So please feel free to register. The URL is there for your convenience, and we look forward to seeing all of you at this event and in future events that we hold. So thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed your time with us.